Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach.
This is episode 84, and my guest today is Marisol LeBrón. Marisol is an assistant professor of Mexican American and Latino studies at the University of Texas at Austin. An interdisciplinary scholar, Marisol's research and teaching focuses on social inequality, policing, violence, and protest. Her first book, which we talk about in the interview, is called Policing Life and Death: Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico. Marisol's research has appeared in publications such as the Radical History Review, the Journal of Urban History, Souls, a Journal of Black Politics, Culture, and Society, Women in Performance, and Policing the Planet: Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter, among others. Marisol's current project, Shared Geographies of Resistance, Puerto Ricans and the Uses of Solidarity, explores the role of Puerto Rican activists in international radical politics and freedom struggles over the course of the 20th century. Marisol is also an active contributor to public conversations and scholarship about Puerto Rico and its diaspora, having published op-eds in The Guardian and Truth Out, and been interviewed by several news outlets about Puerto Rico's debt crisis and the impact of Hurricane Maria. In our interview, Marisol and I discuss how police violence and Hurricane Maria reveal the fraught colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S. government, how scholars can roll with the punches when natural disasters and other major current events upend very carefully planned out research projects, why repair and rest are critical components of any professional career, and how an anti-colonial abolitionist praxis is how Marisol imagines otherwise. Thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you're the author of a new book called Policing Life and Death: Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico. Can you give our listeners a little bit of a sense of what that book covers?
Yeah. So in the book, what I do is I look at the rise of what I call punitive governance in contemporary Puerto Rico. And so what I'm really interested in is the way that structures like policing, incarceration, concern over crime act in a way that hardens pre-existing prejudices and social inequalities based on race, class, gender, sexuality, spatial location in contemporary Puerto Rico. So I'm really interested in looking at policing for what it can tell us about the contemporary relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S. So what I do is look at policing as a kind of optic to analyze shifts and changes in the colonial reality that a lot of Puerto Ricans are experiencing. So I look at the growth of these punitive measures over the course of the 20th century, late 20th century to the present. And then I'm also really interested in the ways that Puerto Ricans push back against some of these policies or try to imagine new ways of understanding safety and security in Puerto Rico. So I'm really interested in cultural production, in activist efforts that are trying to challenge some of these ideas.
In the conclusion of the book, you write about how some of your original plans for this book were pretty drastically transformed. And this is something that a lot of scholars run into when they're studying a living topic, a living object or area or group of people. Stuff comes up, life comes up, and it radically changes our research plans.
Right.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about that because, of course, the giant thing that happened that changed the trajectory of your project was Hurricane Maria, right?
Mm-hmm.
What was that process like of having to respond to this very urgent contemporary issue while still also trying to write a book that you had been planning for quite some time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. And that's one that I actually talked to folks who are kind of writing dissertations now, graduate students. It's one of the things that I always say to them is to kind of be ready to shift projects on kind of the drop of a dime, which is never what people want to hear. But I think it's really important to kind of prepare for those kind of things because, as you said, right, if you're doing stuff that's more based in the contemporary moment, the situation, the context are going to shift the kind of nature of your questions or the nature of what you can actually do in terms of your research. So this project has actually gone through a couple of shifts, right? Hurricane Maria was the latest one, but I talk about this a little bit in the introduction to the book, but even the way that I was able to do this project on the ground when I got to Puerto Rico, when I was a graduate student doing this research for my dissertation, changed dramatically. And so one of the big shifts that happened that actually changed the kind of outcome of the research was when I first got to Puerto Rico in 2011, was that the Department of Justice had issued this really damning report calling the Puerto Rico Police Department one of the most corrupt and violent police departments under U.S. jurisdiction. So for me as a researcher, that really cut off a lot of avenues that I had envisioned for this project in terms of being able to kind of talk to official police sources or folks in the government about police violence. So I had to really shift what I had conceptualized in terms of this project. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is that for me, I think it made the project better. It sucked at the time. It was horrible. And I thought my project was falling apart. There was a lot of tears involved. But, the outcome ended up being that I had to really shift and think more about without official police narratives. I had to decenter that. And I think what ended up happening is I was able to focus more on people who are actually experiencing policing, who are being criminalized, and the kind of cultural production that arose out of those processes, right, in really interesting ways. So I always tell graduate students to be ready for those shifts. But as you noted in your question, the latest kind of shift that happened was around the hurricane. So that happened as I was finishing up the book. And I kind of talk about this a little bit in the conclusion, that I had imagined my conclusion as talking kind of about environmental justice and the way that police were facilitating toxic dumping in Puerto Rico, were acting as armed escorts essentially for this private company that was transporting coal ash into a predominantly Black, low-income community in the south of Puerto Rico. And the hurricane happened, and I didn't know what to do, right? And I think like a lot of folks with familial ties to Puerto Rico, I felt really helpless. And so what the hurricane did for me, and in terms of this project, was really increase the urgency of the project and really make clear, I think, the way that colonialism continues to structure everyday life in Puerto Rico, right? And I think that one of the things that these kind of permutations of the colonial relationship in Puerto Rico has done is hidden a lot of that kind of overt colonialism under this guise of limited sovereignty. But what the hurricane did is really rip a lot of that away. And so that was something I tried to deal with in the end of the book and talk a little bit about and tie back to these questions of policing is one kind of way that we can understand the colonial relationship in Puerto Rico. But things like natural disasters, like Hurricane Maria, give us another optic and another lens to analyze that relationship.
One of the things that I really love about this book, and there are many, I could go on and on, but the episode can only be so long. But you really do demonstrate how the different realms of academic research, of social justice activism kind of on the ground, and artistic or cultural production are deeply interwoven in the phenomenon that you're researching and that you're a part of. And I'd love to turn a little bit more to how those things play out in your own work, both obviously in this project, but also the other kinds of projects and the other kinds of collaborations that you're a part of. What draws you to that nexus?
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with my own training as a scholar, as an American Studies scholar, in terms of taking really seriously modes of cultural production that are often not seen as authentic fonts of knowledge. I was really drawn to thinking about what are these quirky, in some cases, ways of thinking about policing that were not just going on police ride-alongs. For anyone who studies policing or law enforcement kind of realizes very quickly and early on is that, to paraphrase Dean Spade, right, the story that the law tells about itself is not how the law is actually felt and experienced. So for me, looking at activism, at cultural production, so I look at social media, I look at underground rap during the 1990s, and then I look at activism that's happening to try and imagine what would happen if the police were taken out of the picture. And so I look at those to really think about those as avenues that are giving us just as valuable a critique of policing as a structure as those produced by lawyers or scholars or politicians, and even more so because those are actually, in many cases, produced by the communities that are experiencing firsthand those structures in their everyday life.
You brought up American Studies, a traditionally interdisciplinary field, and I know you also do a lot of work that crosses over into gender and sexuality studies, critical race studies, ethnic studies. And these are all fields that a lot of the folks on the show come out of and work in and are deeply committed to. And all of these emphasize a kind of interdisciplinarity or a kind of more holistic approach to knowledge production, as you point out. And one of the things that I know you and I have talked about a little bit is how this spills over into our daily practice as humans rather than just as brains who write smart books and think about smart things. What are some of your favorite self-care or community-based or creative practices that help you feel grounded and sustained and supportive so you can do this kind of work?
So I think that it's really hard, especially for folks who are doing research on these like really pressing, urgent topics. It's really hard to feel like you can take a break. I know I do. I feel really guilty when I do that a lot of times. It's really hard for me, especially when I'm in the thick of a project, to step back and be able to do that. And I think that comes out of the urgency of these projects that a lot of us are doing. And so now that I'm kind of finishing up this project, I've been trying to be much better about that and to try and really think about the ways that that kind of repair, mental repair and physical repair is really crucial when you're doing this kind of work. I mean, it's only now that I'm starting to think kind of a little bit more seriously and critically about what it means to have spent the past essentially 10 years of my life every day thinking about police violence, right? And all of these really horrific stories of discrimination and violence that I have had to deal with over the past 10 years. And so I think that takes a toll on you, right? And I think when you're in it, you're so tunnel vision that you can't see that. And so now I'm trying to really think about how to practice that self-care to be able to continue that work, to avoid burnout. So I'm trying to be much nicer to my body. And so I'm doing things like trying to get out more and not, work 24/7. I'm taking vitamins now, which I never did. So it's like little things like that, but also being willing to take breaks that aren't just where you start working on other stuff. And so I think that having to step back, having to check in with yourself mentally is really crucial. And I think having to have a kind of community, which is fortunately one of the things that I was really good about building as I was working on this project, but a community of folks who you can talk to about these issues. So I've been really lucky to have a kind of cohort of scholars and activists who are also working on pretty heavy topics and working on issues of violence and policing and colonialism and displacement, where I've been able to talk about how some of these things affect me, right? And so that's been really valuable. So I think finding your network of people who are going to sustain you and support you is really critical and really crucial when you're doing this kind of work.
So I know we just talked about self-care and taking a break and letting projects kind of, rest for a minute, which if that's what you're doing right now, that is totally cool. And we advocate that very strongly on the show. But you did mention new projects. Do you want to talk a little bit about stuff you're working on?
Yeah. So, of course, because I do like to distract myself with other projects from the projects I'm working on. I'm working on 2 projects right now, actually, that I'm really thrilled about. So the first project I'm working on is actually an edited volume that I'm working on with my colleague, Yarimar Bonilla, called Aftershocks, which is trying to think about Hurricane Maria as both an aftershock of colonialism, of the current debt crisis that Puerto Rico is in, of these kind of structural inequalities, but then also the kind of aftershocks that have followed in its wake. The other project, I'm starting to slowly shift towards thinking about my next book project, something I'm tentatively calling Shared Geographies of Resistance. In that project, I'm really interested in the ways in which Puerto Ricans have been involved in international solidarity campaigns and freedom movements. So thinking about the ways in which Puerto Ricans, both in Puerto Rico, but also in the diaspora have really connected their struggle against US colonialism and exploitation with other struggles around the globe against colonialism, racism, and military violence. Puerto Ricans have created this shared geography of resistance with other groups over the course of the 20th century to really understand themselves as part of a global struggle against inequality and against fascism. For instance, Puerto Rican involvement in the Irish independence struggle, in the anti-apartheid movement, in the anti-Vietnam movement, and then also Puerto Rican solidarity with Palestine. So those are some of the moments that I'm kind of thinking about, and I'm starting to shift towards that next project, slowly but surely.
So this brings me to my absolute favorite question that I get to ask folks, which really gets at the heart of that big why behind all of these different projects that you do. And that's that version of a better world that you're working towards. So I'll ask you this giant question, but I also think it's a fun question and one that we don't get to ask each other enough, and certainly we don't get enough chances to answer. What kind of world do you want?
I mean, that's a big question. But,
it is. It's giant. I know.
But no, I think that's the crux of the matter, right? That's what we're all kind of writing towards and teaching towards and working towards, right? Is this question of what kind of world do we want to live in? I consider myself an abolitionist. I consider myself someone who is in their scholarship and scholar activism is trying to work towards a world that is free of prisons, free of policing, where we don't have colonialism. Anti-Colonial Abolitionist Praxis, right, is how I imagine my own work. And so for me, the research that I do is trying to really work through those themes, right, and that's definitely comes through in Policing Life and Death in my first book, is really this question of if the police don't necessarily make things better for the people who are kind of interacting with them every day, right? But even for people who are calling the police to deal with problems, who are not necessarily criminalized, but who are using the kind of police, they're not necessarily even satisfied with what the police do in society, right? How can we start to work toward identifying why the police don't function in the way that we want, right? And if they don't function the way that we want, what are the things that are actually going to make us feel safer, are going to make us feel more secure, are going to make us feel good in our communities, right? And I think that's an abolitionist project, to think about, well, if the police don't make us safe, how can we start to work towards and build the things that are going to make us safe? Things like full employment, healthcare, housing, eradicating racism and sexism, right? These really big projects. What I try to do in my research and in my teaching is try to think about what are the small steps to start to get us there, right? What's the incremental change that we need to get us there? And I think part of it is starting to kind of shift people's ideas around these structures as immutable, as having always been there since the beginning of time, to think about the fact that this is not the world that we've always inhabited as humans, right? And that we can build something different.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing all of the creative ways that you imagine and create otherwise.
This was great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad, Rebecca Reynolds, Michelle Velasquez-Potts, and myself, Cathy Hannabach. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.